YouTube, Awesome Rider here. Welcome to my series review for Avataro Sentai DonBrothers, our series following the anniversary series with a very unique set of pretenses, you know, coming from Zenkaiser, which was this very unique looking series with a lot of changes to the way we do things, but at the same time, I would say that Zenkaiser, despite looking even more different than DonBrothers, felt much more like a paint-the-numbers Sentai, whereas DonBrothers, for me, felt like the more unique of the two in terms of shaking up the Sentai formula. But going into this series, you know, we had a lot of rumors about, you know, CGI characters, and it seemed like we might be getting a sort of sequel to Zenkaiser with, you know, Zenkaiser Black and the gears, and just the idea of continuing this unique template that Zenkaiser brought with, you know, possible, like, CGI characters maybe basically being the Kikanoids. And we wound up with something very different than what we thought was going to happen, quite honestly, you know, because the suits honestly are kind of a mix between something unique but a little bit more traditional, and it really did not go the way we thought. And was a much better experience than I was expecting, and a lot different than what I was expecting. You know, as you know, I covered the series weekly for about a little over halfway through, and then I kind of got tired of the Toku grind and kind of stopped watching both Sentai and Rider for a while. But DonBrothers was different enough, and I was invested enough that I wound up coming back. And I did not cover the series weekly because it was kind of nice to be able to cover it at my own pace, and, you know, I didn't necessarily have to watch every week, and I could watch, you know, a couple episodes at a time if I wanted to. Now we're able to actually talk about the full series. I'm going to kind of structure it in a sort of the positives, the negatives / mixed, and then wrap up with some individual character talk and maybe a brief little thoughts on the designs. But let's talk about the positives. I think the best thing about this series was how different it felt in terms of structure. You know, Sentai, Toku in general, is one of the most formulaic things I watch, absolutely. It can feel like purgatory, so many expected things and repetitive elements, and it can get really tiring and repetitive and stagnant. Sentai, I think, more so than most, because you have a lot of the same formula for the series overall, as well as the day in, day out, you know, fight the monster, blow him up, he gets bigger type of thing. And I think this was one of the most different feeling series in regards to structure. You know, the episodes and pacing was very different, both at large and on a case-by-case basis. You wouldn't have very many episodes, or like you would have a lot of episodes, rather, that didn't follow that traditional formula. You know, obviously we had this weird formula where the team didn't come together fully for a really long time. You know, the Black Ranger didn't even have his identity known to the whole team until really the last chunk of the series, which led to some really interesting episode structure, which was really nice. I think that there was still some issues with the pacing, which I'll get into the mixed parts, but I think it made it really refreshing to watch. The fact that every episode didn't feel the same, it led to some interesting different dynamics in the way episodes were structured. You could have episodes that centered only around one character or a couple characters. You might miss out on seeing a couple characters for a few episodes, but it made everything feel different, and the way it was structured was really different, which is so refreshing for a franchise as repetitive as Sentai. And I think it's really funny, I did a video a few years back about how, you know, the difference between Sentai and Rider, and how Rider has found more successful footing than Sentai, and I was talking about how Sentai could stand to take a page out of Rider's book. Not try to be like Rider, but I think one of Rider's strengths is its serialization. And this series felt very Rider-esque, but also it didn't feel like it was trying to be Rider. Like, there was elements that felt very similar to Rider to me, but it felt like Sentai's take on Rider in some ways. Like, again, not feeling fully like Rider, but in terms of the series felt more serialized to me. Like, there was, you know, ongoing storylines, there was ongoing mythology mysteries, ongoing mysteries with stuff like Zenkaiser Black, and almost every character also had their own individual storyline. So almost every episode contributed in every way, and I think that's something that's beneficial to Rider, is, you know, Rider does have filler, but more often than not, when you tune in, you're going to learn a little something about something that's ongoing. And DonBrothers had that in its favor, that every episode contributed in some way. You know, I think I could count on one hand the number of episodes that were sort of valueless to the overall narrative. And even with those, most of them were entertaining. I think there was maybe 2 or 3 episodes that I didn't really care for, that either didn't contribute to the series overall and I found to be annoying. But even some of its filler episodes, like the one about that ghost girl, that episode you could skip and not miss anything important to the overall narrative, but was a very entertaining and engaging episode. So I think it had a lot of strengths with that, with feeling a little more serialized. It's interesting seeing reactions on both sides of the fence, where people will agree with that sentiment that it was more serialized with more going on, and some people felt like there was nothing going on, because it had a very different pace. It wasn't a traditional, like, point A, point B, point C plot. It was kind of more like we were widening the scope of what we knew about the series, and the progression came from developing the characters and learning more about the world and situation we were in. So it progressed differently, but I would argue it's a little bit more of a serialized story than most Sentai, which is something I really enjoyed about it. And I think it did a good job of fleshing out its characters. Not everybody got a focus, and I think some had some really detrimental problems with it, but the ones they did focus on I think worked. I think they had a really good job of developing the characters they did focus on and progressing their stories. I think there was some really strong moments in that progression, like with Momotaro's story about, gaining these bonds and becoming a better person. I think that was a really significant strength. I think it did a good job, for the most part, at pacing its reveals and deepening your understanding of the world. And I think that there was some really good character engagement with stories like the romance between, Pink Black and Natsumiho. For whatever reason, I'm actually kind of a sucker for when they have those romance stories in Toku. I think because it can be some almost good, like, soapy, like, engagement. But at the same time, I think it gives more personal stakes to things, which is really nice. But as far as some of the more negative, mixed aspects of the series, I did like the pacing and the difference in the pacing, but it could lead to some awkward pacing at times. Even though I did appreciate how unique it was that the Black Ranger wasn't brought into the fold, I think they waited a bit too long with that, mainly because I think that there's some more material and dynamics to be mined from him being known to the team, and I think when you do it so close to the end, you miss out on that, so I think that could have been stood to happen earlier. I think there was some absolutely abysmal pacing and, in regards to Don Goku and Murasame. I don't think they were integrated into the plot very well. So it wasn't perfect. Like, I did like the pacing, but it did present some problems within it, which could be annoying. One of my other negatives, or more, I guess, mixed to negative aspects, was the Zenkaiser elements. I like Zenkaiser Black and his inclusion in the series, and I appreciated the mystery to it, and we'll see if we get answers in the movie or later. Let's not make it a Arutaki situation where we still don't really know what's going on. But maybe, that might retroactively make things better, but there was an element of mystery to that I did enjoy. Like, I was legit curious, like, who is he? Where does he come from? How does this go? It was cool. I like mysteries like that. Same thing with the gears. I was, like, legitimately curious. But the inclusion of that definitely felt rather forced, at the end of the day. Like, setting aside the Zenkaiser Black elements, I'm so sick to death of the team-ups and anniversary garbage. Like, let's transform into past heroes. It's so freaking annoying now. The fact that they transformed into past heroes, to the series' credit, didn't get in the way of what made DonBrothers good. Like, as the series went on, I was more invested in DonBrothers' characters and story, to the point where the Zenkaiser anniversary stupid stuff didn't get in the way of it. It never made it feel like it knocked the series down some pegs. But it was so weirdly included because they never addressed it. Not like I wanted the Legacy Sentai crap to invade the series, but it's just so weird that they transformed into Sentai heroes and, like, never acknowledged it. Like, in Zenkaiser, whenever they use a power, they'd be like, oh, this is from such and such Sentai. And it's been an integral part of the plot, or at least an explained part of the plot in any other series that uses it. And it was just so out of place, and it was, like, used to such a weirdly paced and sparing degree that there would be really long periods of time where they didn't use it or didn't use it at all, to the point where it happened, I'm like, oh, that's weird. So I wish that wasn't there. Or if it was, I wish there was a way to integrate it in a way that it didn't take me out of it. I feel it was unnecessary. I mean, stuff like the monsters being based on past series was interesting, just because it was so harmless. Like, that's what I want to see from future anniversary series, is fun little nods like that. We don't need to do a full-blown, overblown, loud, like, celebration every time. But that was, like, harmless. And stuff like the little mini forms was harmless too, but it definitely felt more like a corporate inclusion than, like, something that serviced the story. And that was another sort of negative mixed issue with the series, was stuff like the little mini Robotaro forms. I don't think those were called the Robotaro, the Avataro forms or whatever. They actually were pretty cool in design in regards to the individual bots, but those definitely felt like, the toyetic aspect of Toku coming in, where they really only were there for the first quarter of the series, or stuff like Don Murasame when he first debuted, it was only there the first few times. So there was some, like, balance issues there as well in regards to the mixed aspects. It's like, basically, I like that DonBrothers was a very different series, but it also led to some weird pacing at times too that provided some mixed negative aspects, as well as I think the anniversary elements, the legacy aspects, were very awkwardly included. Again, to the series' credit, it didn't make a detrimental mark on the series overall, and the positives and DonBrothers' own identity I think was able to outshine it, but it still created this really awkward inclusion that felt like it was at odds with the story being told versus the Toei Bandai corporate toy aspect. Now let's talk about some characters, because this is going to lead to both some positive and negative, sort of going over everyone. Don Momotaro. Don Momotaro is an interesting character in the sense that he is kind of almost an amalgam of all the different types of Reds you can get. A little bit of that stoic, cocky jerk, a little bit of that specialist, quirky boy character, you know, and he actually wasn't so much of a loudmouth. Only really when he did his whoa, it was like that annoying Toku Red. But in a way, he was kind of an amalgam of all those. And I wouldn't say I loved his character, I wouldn't say I hated his character, but I would say by the end I liked it and I appreciated what they did with him, in the sense that it was kind of a well-done progression, and also almost feeling like a meta-commentary on Sentai Reds at the beginning. Like, the way we set him up where it's like, he was that classic Toku Red that's like the specialist boy, good at everything, and is usually in any other series worshipped by every character for being this freaking weirdo. But like, he was disliked for that, which I mean, it's supposed to be sad, which it was, and I think was given an emotional, nice resolution where, you know, he was not liked as a kid, but then by the end of the series, you have that really touching scene in the penultimate episode where he has gained a group of friends and people that love him for who he is, which I think was well done in terms of, you never fully changed who he was, but you could see him change a little bit, and you could see him gain this found family, which was well done. But coming back to my earlier point, it was supposed to be sad, but it was almost weirdly satisfying to see that type of character actually be reacted to in a realistic way, where it's like, yeah, he's annoying as hell, of course you wouldn't like him. So I liked the way his character was done in the sense that it felt like a good progression, but almost a pseudo-meta commentary on Sentai Reds. Briefly talk about Saru Brother, because I feel like he got the least to do of the core 5, even the core 6 really. I feel like his whole character just amounted to a bit. You know, there was some slightly more substantial episodes, but I found it to be the most overshadowed. So I personally don't have a whole lot to say about him, and other than he was fine for what he was, and this video is going to be long enough as what it is. If you can have more to add about how Saru Brother was more dynamic than I think, I welcome it in the comments. Oni's sister, I think, was mostly likable. I think she skirted a nice edge between being an actual character with an arc about this, you know, overcoming this plagiarism and overcoming this whole struggle, and also being, you know, a little bit of that classic Toku, like, in-your-face type of character. You know, I think the best moments for her were like when she had an opportunity to wish her way out of the situation, but then she chose to be a Don brother, and then at the end of the series, overcoming it, you know, moving past it, making her own manga and embracing the plagiarist name and sort of, you know, taking all the good and throwing away the bad. And I think that she worked overall well for the series. And I like that for especially a lot of the early series, she was kind of our point of view character, which was rather refreshing. And also the plagiarist being a future alternate version of her was the most DonBrothers thing of all time. I feel like I have to talk about Kiji Brother and Inui Brother together. Now, Kiji Brother early on was probably my favorite character, and I would say he's probably one of my more favorite characters in the series because he was so vastly interesting in ways I wasn't expecting. Like, early on, I found it to be really relatable to have this very everyman, almost down on himself character that was like an older married character. Also, he just felt different than a lot of Toku characters. But the fact that it slowly turned into this dark obsession where he was very dependent on the love of his wife was so disturbing and interesting and funny and annoying at the same time. And it was really unexpected and refreshing. Like, the fact that he did literally villainous things where he kept becoming a monster of the week multiple times, but would have stuff like when he turned in Inui Brother. And it was like, it was so unexpected. Like, he didn't wind up being my favorite at the end because he ended up becoming borderline unlikable, but in a way that was well done. Like, it took some unexpected turns, and it was maybe a little bit fast resolution of him learning to, you know, be more reliant on himself at the end, but I think it was a very interesting character with very likable moments and highs and lows, and very unexpected in great ways. I think Inui Brother wound up being my favorite. I mean, most of all, I mean, come on, having the stereotypical, like badass Black Ranger be this adorable Sonic chibi character just worked in a way that I really liked. But his character, I think I was the most invested in, and I admired him for how much adversity he faced, and he always overcame it, and was able to be more gracious with the whole situation with Kino, and, you know, find this resolution even after things with Natsumi didn't work out, and I think I enjoyed his character the most. And honestly, I like the way the love triangle was handled. Like, if you asked me at the beginning, I would say that the most generic resolution would have been for Natsumi, whoever she was, to find out that she that she, didn't fit with him and fit with her husband. But that ended up happening, but in a roundabout way that I wasn't expecting, involving the complicated dynamics. And I think mostly worked out. Like the involvement of Sononi with the storyline really added this other X factor, making it this love quadrangle that really worked for me, where like the ending kind of ended up being the most generic thing I could think of, but it was done in such a twisty-turny way that it felt satisfying and bittersweet. Like the fact that, Natsumiho was able to find this dream life and other aspect and found out she didn't fit with him. But, Inui brother had this heartbreak of it not working out after all this time pining after her and this life, but he found something new, and I think it ultimately worked for me. Now we gotta talk about Jiro, who I think is one of the most complicated elements of the series. I almost was gonna say he was my most disliked character, but I think he's just the biggest disappointment. I have this complicated relationship with Sentai 6 Rangers in recent years, where I feel that like there's always the cycle of course it's going to be gold and silver again, but then the suit always wins me over because it's always great looking, and then the character always, not always, because not in every case, but more often than not ends up becoming a cartoon, where they don't feel like a real character, they just feel like a bit. They feel like the, Silent Clement, like the future is now thanks to science, I'm a connoisseur everything from Pokemon. They feel like they become a cartoon. And that's what he felt like in a way. Like it was interesting because you had the main version, Dondragoku, who was like, just wanting to fit in and be a part of the team and surpass and replace Momotaro. And then you had his evil side, which I'm like, oh, this is cool. We get the best of both worlds, Hannah Montana style. But as it went on, they both kind of became cartoons. They both felt like cartoony versions of themselves with only a few endearing moments throughout it. And I think it was poorly handled, in my opinion. Although I do want to give kudos to the actor for being able to play sort of the goofy, cartoony, I want to be fit-in character, and then sort of an exaggerated badass, and then this very balanced version of himself at the end, which I really found him to be so likable when he behaved like a normal human being. And by the end of the series, when they resolved it, it had me not mad at the character, because very often he would be the most annoying to me, but more disappointed, because I'm like, man, there was a lot of potential here. With the two personalities, like, yeah, you have some potential for some toku nonsense, but there was some immense character potential here, especially when you get to the resolution. And it felt like after his debut, he became a cartoon, and then we saw him so few and far between, it felt weird because it almost felt like they didn't want to have a Six Ranger or didn't have room for him, so he was hardly in the series, and yet his role in the story and as a character fits. So it's not like his character feels like an alien inclusion, it feels like it fits with everything they're doing, but the way they paced it made it feel like he wasn't meant to be there in a way. And his resolution at the end had some good parts, but it felt like a B plot, like all the resolution about him learning about what his purpose was as supposed to be this guardian for the bestials, and learning to accept his friends were illusions and all that stuff. It felt like it was this afterthought in an episode that was about something else, and it was really cool to see him actually unite that, and it had some good parts and actually see this balanced version of him. And it left me thinking like, man, if they would have actually had some more human moments with his character and paced that correctly, he could have been one of my favorites. Now, speaking of not fitting, there's Don Murasame. I mean, I think the sole reason this dude was here is because Stacy was successful and they wanted another Rogue Purple Ranger. There were some interesting aspects to the idea, but he only appeared every now and then, and this was something where I felt like he could have been included organically into the series, but he honestly felt like it was just forced there to have that character, especially in the finale. Biggest wasted opportunity, which in a way is understandable because you have 6 Rangers plus the 3 Cerebrans, which you effectively made main characters. So I think there was some missed potential here, and that's all I'll say. Like, whereas Dondragoku, the way they included him in terms of pacing, felt like it was forced, even though his character fit in. This character felt like it had the potential to fit in, but felt like a forced corporate thing. Zenkaiser Black, I really liked his presence in the series. I really wish we could have found out who he was by the end, and I hope we get some sort of satisfying resolution in the movie, even if it kind of leaves it open-ended where you have to come up with your own conclusions. But regardless, it was weird having that slight out-of-place mystery to it, but I overall enjoyed his presence in the series. And again, I want to give props to the actor for almost being able to play, not almost, but he was able to play the two, most common sides of a protagonist. Like, he obviously wasn't a protagonist, but he was able to play that annoying, energetic character when he was the main character in Zenkaiger, but here he was able to play the stoic character that had some funny moments, and I want to give credit to his actor, and I enjoyed the mystery he added to it, but I honestly just enjoyed his presence, and it ended up being kind of a dropped ball on the hybrid element in a way, which I'll talk about sort of the wrap-up at the end, but I liked him being in the series. Now, talking about the villains, obviously you have the main three villains, which became main characters overall, and I ended up liking their role in the story, and I think they were very much that element that felt like a writer aspect, where you had these more human characters in gray areas, which was really interesting. Sonoi, I think, was ultimately, for me, that very generic story of the sort of grayish area main villain that has respect for the Red Ranger that ends up becoming an ally. Like, not that I didn't like it, I think that whole weird time where he was resurrected and acted like Momotaro and then it was just normal again. Like, that was, I don't know, it was weird. But, I mean, it was generic, but it was enjoyable. I think Sononi was my favorite because I think it was the most unexpected. I honestly felt like Sonoi was going to be the only one to get a redemption arc, and the other two were just there to have these aspects of, like, trying to figure out human emotion, whether it be the love or the expressive emotion for Sonoza. But Sononi ended up being the one that I was surprised by because of her inclusion in the quadrangle. And so I appreciated her development the most, and I found it to be the most interesting and investing, because it was very imperfect, where she would have these selfish moments, but then feel bad about it and pull back and do something selfless. Sonoza, I think, was the most unneeded of the redemption. I felt was the most cartoony. There was some nice bits with his involvement in Oni Sister's story in regards to her manga and all that, but I felt that it was the least investing, and I don't like that they redeemed all three of them. I don't like when they always have to redeem all the human characters. I know they didn't redeem all of them because they came in with those three clowns at the end, but you know what I mean. I think it would have been much more interesting and less predictable to have Sonoi and Sononi join the team, but then have one left over, which was Sonoza, who couldn't connect with humanity and winds up staying the course and maybe team up with the two evil villains at the end. I would have preferred that. And speaking of the other Cerebrans, I loved their suits of the new characters, but the three new ones I didn't like at all. Like, clearly those three and the two at the end were there because they needed villains to face after we've redeemed our main villains. But the other three, I just hated that they were basically cartoons. They're like almost everything I hate in a Toku character. They're just an annoying cartoon, a facial expression, and a scream. I didn't like them at all. I appreciated their role in the story, but I didn't care for them as characters at all. The two at the end, on the other hand, I really liked, and I think I would have preferred something like that, or at least a balance. Have two characters that are a little bit more serious, just meant to be final villains, and then maybe one clown. I really did like the interesting dynamics of the villains overall in the series. It was very non-traditional and interesting, like I talked about with the Cerebrans, but even the Bestials, kind of this aspect between this almost mindless beast character, but then they have a characterization of their own because they were created for this special purpose, and they had these unique character dynamics. You know, everything surrounding Natsumi and Miho was very interesting, and another credit to the actress for being able to play this dream version of herself, actual her, and then bestial her. It created this really interesting mystery and this interesting dynamic. I mean, hell, even the henchmen had their own role in the food chain and got characterization in one episode. I also like how the Monsters of the Week were done. They were very writer-esque in the sense that, you know, we have experimented with Characters of the Week being tied to monsters before in series like Ryu Soldier, but more often than not, Sentai monsters are just monsters, either created or a part of an army, and then writer always does the, you know, Monster of the Week is tied to a human, whether it's the person turning into it or a contract or something like that. And we basically did a very writer-esque setup here, and they were very throwaway, which I didn't mind, but I actually kind of liked it. Like, yeah, we focused on a handful of them, and you'd have some reoccurring ones, and some where they tried to solve their problems, but like 70 to 80% of the time, we were so remarkably uninterested with resolving that character's conflict. It was hilarious. Because like in Rider, they spend so much time like, oh, we gotta solve their personal problems. We didn't almost care at all. Like, we would be introduced, like, why they became a monster. They would defeat him back in their life. We didn't solve it. I found that to be, honestly, kind of hilarious. Just to briefly touch on designs, I have to say I really mostly like the designs of the series. The suits really grew on me. You know, it's funny because the CGI was wonky at times, but pink and black were probably my favorite just for being the most unique out of the core group. Of course, DonBrothers, I think, is one of the best sixth of all time. Despite it being yet another gold, just works so well. But the series suits, like in terms of the core ones, were a great mix between something kind of new with the unique proportions in CGI, but also familiar. Murasame's suit was great. I wish the character had been more because the suit grew on me more and more. I think that symmetry of the helmet still was a little too similar to Kiji Brothers, but man, I just do like that suit a lot. You know, the Robotaro forms were really well designed. I liked them a lot. I liked all the mecha of the series. Don Oni Chaijin was just a badass look. DonBrothers has to be one of my favorite of all time. Really unique color scheme, just such a great design there. Even though they didn't use the mini forms a lot, you know, their designs were really well done in terms of the core robots. I love the designs of the Cerebrans. They almost look like an entirely new type of Toku character. I think they were really well done, and I like that we got even more of them by the time the series ends. Before I get to my final verdict, I did want to touch upon the interesting aspect, which was this sort of sequel hybrid aspect, which it's funny because with what DonBrothers wound up being, despite having carryovers and aesthetics and this like carryover character and this weird preamble that made it seem like there was going to be sequel elements, it very much stood on its own, and I'm grateful for it. In fact, the DonBrothers identity and story managed to overshadow any of that baggage, and I wouldn't want to have changed it to be more integrated with Zenkaiger. I admit that I'm a little bit disappointed that it didn't amount to something because of the idea of a more continuous mythology and connectedness is interesting to me. And maybe if they can continue that in the movies in a way that's more concrete and not a toku mess, that would be great. But I'm a little bit disappointed because the idea of almost a pseudo-sequel series in the future I think is something that Sentai hasn't done really before and could be something to do in the future. And I'm a little bit disappointed more wasn't done with that. But now that I obviously know about what DonBrothers was about, I'm glad that it didn't overshadow it and DonBrothers was able to have its own identity, as I was very worried when the series started that it was going to feel like a continuation of what we already got, and very much stood out on its own. But overall, guys, this was not a perfect series, but I enjoyed it a lot. It was able to feel like some good Sentai enjoyment, and yet feel like a breath of fresh air. The breath of fresh air I've needed for a long time, especially coming off of Zenkaiger, which was so different aesthetically, but wasn't very different structurally for me. And I was really surprised that this actually was the breath of fresh air. You know, there were some characters left by the wayside, some pacing issues, some leftover questions, a really enjoyable series that's not going to be from everyone, but I think is a unique breath of fresh air that I'm really happy we got. And I don't hope every series is like it, but I hope we have more series that are a breath of fresh air like this. Not a perfect series, but a good man. No, but I really like the show. I'm going to give it a 4 out of 5. Not perfect, but it was really great. It's kind of like this weird flip side of Kara Major, where Kara Major felt like this throwback to what I liked about Sentai when I first got into it, whereas this felt like a little bit of something new mixed with something I liked about the Toku I used to watch before sort of more modern Toku. But what did you guys think about the DonBrothers series? Let me know in the comments as always. Till next time, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and climb the steps and ring that bell to get notifications for all my videos. Dawson Ryder, signing out.